A plane covered in ice and snow lined up on the runway in Denver, Colorado after much confusion. It barreled down the runway, ready to head to Boise, Idaho. Unfortunately, it would never make it there, as it hurtled off the side of the runway, leaving behind death, injury, and horrified onlookers. But how does this happen? Continental Airlines Flight 1713 was operated using a 21-year-old McDonnell Douglas DC-914, a twin-engined, narrow-body jet airliner with the registration number November 626 Tango X-Ray. It was originally delivered to Air Canada in May of 1966 and sold to Texas International Airlines in 1968, where it served the majority of its service until Texas International was acquired by Continental in 1982. In 21 years of service, it had accumulated over 52,400 flight hours and over 61,800 cycles. The captain was Frank Benjamin Zvonek Jr., 43, who had been with Continental Airlines since 1969. He had 12,125 hours of flight experience, but only 166 hours on the DC-9, or on type. He'd only been upgraded to captain less than 3 weeks earlier. The first officer was Lee Edward Bruscher, 26, hired by Continental 4 months prior. He'd previously flown for Rio Airways and had passed his initial proficiency check in the DC-9 in mid-September. He had 3,186 flight hours, but only 36 hours on the DC-9, which was the extent of his turbojet experience, and he had not flown at all for the past 24 days. The cabin crew consisted of 3 flight attendants. At the time of the accident on the afternoon of Sunday, November 15, 1987, in Denver, Colorado, the National Weather Service was reporting moderate wet snow at Stapleton International Airport. The heaviest snowfall rate occurred between 1:10 p.m. and 2:20 Mountain Standard Time, with the peak snowfall rate occurring around 1:50 p.m. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments section. Continental Airlines Flight 1713 was scheduled to depart Denver for Boise at 12:25 p.m., but many flights out of Denver that day were delayed by the inclement weather. At 1:03 p.m., Flight 1713 taxied from its gate to the de-icing pad. Unfortunately, air traffic controllers were not aware that Flight 1713 had departed the gate because the flight crew had done so without first requesting taxi clearance. De-icing was completed at 1:46 p.m. At 1:51 p.m., Flight 1713 contacted the clearance delivery controller for permission to, quote, taxi from the ice pad. The clearance delivery controller, believing that Flight 1713 was still at the gate and requesting to proceed to de-icing, instructed the flight to contact ground control, who then cleared Flight 1713 to taxi to the de-icing pad. Having already completed de-icing, Flight 1713's crew seems to have interpreted this new clearance to mean they could now taxi from the pad and proceed to the runway. At 2:05 p.m., Flight 1713 was lined up on the number 1 position at the north end of runway 35 left, and the crew was ready for takeoff. Not kept properly informed of Flight 1713's position, the air traffic controllers tried repeatedly to have different planes take off, leaving Flight 1713 standing in the falling snow for several minutes and opening the airliner to the risk of, quote, wing contamination by ice. Flight 1713 then notified air traffic controllers that they were holding at the start of the runway and awaiting takeoff instructions. Flight 1713 was cleared for takeoff at 2:14 p.m. As the DC-9 was taking off, the pilot in control over-rotated. The aircraft descended and the left wing struck the ground, causing the wing to separate. A fuel-fed flash fire ignited in the left wing shortly after it struck the ground, causing a fireball inside the cabin. The left side of the fuselage and cockpit struck the ground next, and the plane continued rolling until inverted. As the DC-9 skidded, the left side was tilted over, and the tail was inverted. This action caused the center section of the fuselage to compress and crush many of the passengers on board. A total of 25 passengers and 3 crew members died in the crash. The final 2 fatalities succumbed while hospitalized. The cabin, the first officer, 1 flight attendant, and 11 of the passengers died from blunt trauma. In addition, 5 passengers died of head injuries secondary to blunt trauma, and 9 passengers died of asphyxia. Rest in peace to the 28 who perished on Flight 1713. May they rest easy. The remaining 52 passengers and 2 flight attendants survived. Of the surviving passengers, 25 received minor injuries and 27 received serious injuries. Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center sent its personnel to assist in the triage of passengers, and 10 hospitals treated the survivors. If you like history and disasters, make sure to check out my other channel, Shipwreck Sunday. The NTSB investigated the accident. In July of 1988, Continental Airlines filed a report with the NTSB positing that the causes of the crash as wake turbulence, poor snow plowing on the runway, and errors by air traffic controllers. However, the NTSB investigated the wake turbulence theory and concluded that wake turbulence from the preceding flight would not have affected Flight 1713. During the investigation, the crew's low levels of experience on the DC-9 were brought up as possible causes. Investigators also discovered that before he began working for Continental, Brewster had been dismissed from another airline after failing on 3 occasions to pass a flight examination. Investigators likewise determined that First Officer Brewster was at the controls at the time of the accident. Investigators determined that 27 minutes elapsed between the conclusion of de-icing and Flight 1713's attempt to take off, 7 minutes longer than should have been allowed to elapse before takeoff. The NTSB concluded that a buildup of ice on the wings of Flight 1713 had contaminated the surfaces of both of the wings prior to departure, based on reports from surviving passengers that they had seen patches of ice on the wings after de-icing was complete. Investigators also concluded that enough wet snow had landed on Flight 1713 after de-icing was complete to melt and dilute the de-icing fluid, which allowed ice to reform on the wings. According to the aircraft's manufacturer, even a modest amount of ice contamination on the upper wing could impair the lifting performance of the wings and lead to loss of roll and pitch control. Based on this, the NTSB concluded that a small amount of ice on the wings had caused Flight 1713 to have significant controllability problems. The NTSB also determined that First Officer Brewster's poor performance during takeoff had likely contributed to his loss of control of the airplane. The first officer rotated the airplane at more than 6 degrees per second, or twice the recommended rate. Combined with the effects of ice on the wing, the high climb rate caused the plane's left wing to stall, and the plane began rolling over. Flight 1713 was Brewster's first flight after a 24-day absence from flight duties, and the NTSB concluded that this prolonged absence had eroded the newly hired first officer's retention of his recent training, which contributed to his poor takeoff performance. On September 27, 1988, the NTSB published a final report on its investigation into the crash, attributing the accident to the captain's failure to have the plane de-iced a second time, the first officer's poor takeoff performance, and confusion between the pilots and air traffic controllers, which contributed to delays, compounded by a cockpit crew where both pilots were relatively inexperienced on the aircraft type. Specifically, the NTSB stated, quote, "The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of this accident was the captain's failure to have the airplane de-iced a second time after a delay before takeoff that led to upper wing surface contamination and a loss of control during rapid takeoff rotation by the first officer. Contributing to the accident were the absence of regulatory or management controls governing operations by newly qualified flight crew members, and the confusion that existed between the flight crew members and air traffic controllers that led to the delay in departure." After the crash, Continental Airlines reiterated its procedures for handling de-icing, and developed a computerized assignment program that would prevent green-on-green crewing, or keep pilots with fewer than 100 hours flying time and type from being assigned to the same flight. 9 months after the crash of Flight 1713, Delta Airlines Flight 1141 crashed in Dallas. When the NTSB released its report on Flight 1713, it specifically mentioned the fact that, quote, "almost 3 minutes of non-pertinent social conversation had occurred before takeoff." When the NTSB later issued its report on Delta 1141, it found that the Delta crew had also engaged in non-pertinent conversation, including a discussion of the cockpit voice recorder from the crash of Continental 1713. First Officer Carrie Kirkland joked with Flight Attendant Dixie Dunn, the latter being a fatality, that they too should discuss their crew's love lives so, quote, then the media would have some kind of juicy tidbit from their CVR in the event of a similar disaster. If you want me to cover Delta 1141, let me know.